This video contains some imagery and discussion of graphic historical events for historical education purposes. Viewer discretion is advised. Hey everyone, I have something different and special for you today. I'm here with Jared, our special guest, and he's brought along some artifacts that are very interesting, and it sounds like perhaps with dark backstories that we'll learn about today. So I have yet to see any of these. Jared, you showed me some of your personal collection, but I've turned a blind eye to these items so I can see them for the first time with all of you. So Jared, why don't you tell us a bit about what we'll look at today and about yourself?
Okay. Well, to start off, thank you for having me on your channel.
Thank you.
Great
for
honor
being
once
here.
again. Great to see you again since Conneaut.
Yes,
We're here in slightly less chaotic environs this time, which is nice.
Certainly.
I'm the host of Real History on YouTube, and we look at Hollywood and heritage, and we look at what the movies get wrong about the past, what they sometimes get right, and everything in between. So we look at a lot of World War II movies. I think many of your viewers would enjoy our content.
Certainly. And in addition to this video, we're doing another video together that will be posted on the Real History page. So if you're not already subscribed to Real History on YouTube, make sure to do that so you can see me talk with Jared more on their page.
What we are going to take a look at today are World War II artifacts associated with American service members that have dark or tragic stories behind them. Of the 400,000 Americans who perish in the war, of the 65 million people globally who die as a result of this conflict, there are many stories of tragedy to be found. But I find that these stories are most palpable when we have artifacts and images and documents that help bring those stories to life. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at today.
Absolutely. That sounds great. You know, I'm a collector as well, so having those physical objects to tie into the history and get some of the backstory behind them, that's my bread and butter. So I'm looking forward to see what,
all right,
what
let's
you
take
have
a look.
for us. Yeah.
The first artifact that we have for today is a Box 44 camera produced by the AGFA Camera Company, which interestingly enough was located out of Munich, Germany. And this particular model was made throughout the 1930s, roughly from 1932 to 1938. And this camera belonged to a sergeant of the 80th Infantry Division, within that the 317th Regiment Medical Battalion. His name was Sergeant Fred Weekland. Fred Weekland had been a junior high school teacher in the years preceding the war, and he was drafted at age 35, the maximum age that you could be drafted. And of course, he was, through basic training, trying to keep up with people who were almost half his age, who previously would have been his students. And so he did not like Army life at all, and he complained about it frequently. But because he was a clerk with a medical battalion, he could get away with certain things that many GIs could not. Particularly, he could stash away a camera in all of his field desks and things as such. And as a result, we have a rather fascinating photographic record associated with this man. And he has pictures of blown up bridges across the Rhine, soldiers from his outfit, so on and so forth. But most horrific of all are photographs that he took with this camera the first week of April 1945, because the men of his regiment were among the first of those to liberate Ohrdruf concentration camp. And he had this camera with him as he was taking those photographs. And that was the very first camp that was liberated by American GIs. Patton and Eisenhower and Omar Bradley would go to visit that camp a few days later. That's when Eisenhower famously said that these scenes have to be thoroughly photographed because there would be some SOB in the future who would say that it never happened, and Eisenhower wanted a visual record of it to be made. And interestingly enough, some of the first American taken photographs were perhaps with this camera that we see right here. To make this story even more compelling, Sergeant Weekland wrote a letter home to his family, which was later published in his hometown newspaper. And it's a fairly lengthy letter, but I think it's worthwhile to share 2 brief paragraphs from that, because I think it really helps us to set and to visualize the scene and also convey the emotions that were going through him as he was experiencing this. And he said, "Since I haven't been receiving any mail so as to comment on things, I will have to talk about a tour some of us made today. If I ever get back to teaching, I will be able to teach about democracy much better after what I saw today. I have seen pictures and heard about such places as concentration camps. It took a little guts to look at the sites, but I felt I wanted to be educated in some of the principles of the Germans. It gave me a funny feeling to go through the gates and be within the wire fence that held so many and where so much suffering was done. At first, one would have thought there was a fair or something from the amount of traffic going through the camp. I suppose the officers thought it would give us a better idea of why we were fighting down their principles. We went to an area where there were about a dozen bodies in a heap. It was a sight, but we went over the hill where they were burying them. In this area, I suppose there were 50 bodies or so. I was told they were about starved to death, and they were shot and killed on April 3rd. There was plenty of blood around." Wow. And so we have a very compelling first-hand account that gives further credence to the images that this camera took.
Right. That's such an incredible story. And you're right, absolutely, about what you said before, having these objects there to carry those story on and to know the connection that this has to those events. It's really incredible. All right, Jared, I see there's a new item on the table. What do you have for us next here?
What we have here is something that was very commonly presented to Gold Star families on the home front. There are many ways to pay tribute to the fallen. Many hometowns would have even temporary markers, let's say in a community park or in front of a courthouse, to pay tribute to local sons and daughters who had perished in the war. And one thing that local Rotary clubs would do during the war is that they would present certificates like this to local families. And this one has to deal with a staff sergeant from Pennsylvania whose name was Paul B. Crawford. Interestingly enough, a friend of mine found this in an old building that was essentially slated for demolition. And he's not altogether sure how it ended up there, but it ultimately worked its way to me. And through some research, I was able to find out what happened to Sergeant Crawford. And his hometown newspaper had this to say. Staff Sergeant Paul B. Crawford, son of Mrs. M. P. Crawford, member of the Army Air Forces, was killed in an airplane crash near Innisfall, Queensland, Australia, on February 28th. The War Department has advised this to the mother. No details were given. A brief notice of the flyer's death appeared yesterday in the newspaper. Sergeant Crawford has expected to come home shortly, and his mother was awaiting word from him when she received the telegram announcing his death. His last letter was dated February 3rd and received March 3rd. And so the great tragedy associated with this artifact is that the family was anticipating this man to come home. They received the dreaded Western Union telegram, perhaps expecting it to be a salutation from him or something announcing his arrival home, and instead it ends up being his death notice, and Sergeant Crawford remains missing to this very day.
Man, wow, yeah, that is a tragic story there, and unfortunately not an uncommon one.
Correct.
During that time.
But I think it's always so important that when we think about World War II, we think purely of battles, but I think it's also significant that we remember the cost of the home front, because for the 400,000 plus service members who perish in the United States Armed Forces during World War II, that means that there were over 800,000 parents that lost a son or a daughter in the war as well, and tangible items like this are a grim reminder of that.
Absolutely.
Would you like to read the language for?
I would love to take a look.
Yeah, and you can read it to the audience. So.
With deep regret and undying pride, the Altoona Rotary Club honors the memory of Paul B. Crawford, who made the supreme sacrifice for country and fellow man on February 18th, 1944. While his finite nobility has now merged into the infinite, and the physical presence which was once known has passed away, yet the spirit of the gift, the giver, and the giving lies still in memory. His contribution knew no mundane bounds, and its aura surrounds those near and dear to him with the fragrance of eternity.
Wow. We don't use language like that anymore.
No,
That's
wow.
powerful.
It really is. What an amazing piece to have. All right, Jared, what is the next dark artifact that we have to look at here?
Well, a very infamous episode of the latter phases of U.S. involvement in the war deals with a young enlisted man from the 28th Infantry Division whose name was Eddie Slovik. And he is, of course, known for being executed on January 31st in 1945. And he was the first American soldier to be killed by firing squad for desertion. And there was a lot of controversy about that as it played out, and there's still a huge degree of controversy to it to this very day. But there was surprisingly a lot of pomp and ceremony that went into this rather grim event, because it wasn't merely a matter of a dozen or so of his fellow comrades from the 28th Division who were executing him. They also brought in approximately 50 other enlisted men from throughout the division to witness the execution.
Wow.
And this was done to send a message to the rest of the men in the unit: don't desert, leave your comrades, or this is the fate that may befall you. In the book, The Execution of Private Slovik, there is a listing of every man who was present at the execution. And among those who were there was Norman Dutch Coda, who came to be commander of the 28th Division and had been assistant division commander for the 29th Division on Omaha Beach. But also, among the men who were there that day was Joseph Vitorisi, and I just so happened to have his dog tags right here. And this was his copy of the book, and he circled himself in the back of the book. Wow. And so, in all likelihood, the strong likelihood, these dog tags were present at the execution of Private Slovik.
What an amazing pairing to have. The book along with it, too. It's just incredible.
Yes.
I won't ask your secrets behind how you came to own this.
Well, as it turns out, every fall, there is a huge military show called the Max Show, Military Artifacts Extravaganza.
Yeah, I've been there plenty of times
and
myself.
There are many high-end items for sale at that event, most of which are far beyond my price range. I mean, there's Hermann Goering's flags and watercolors by Hitler and things that are have absurd price tags to them, naturally so. What I always do then when I go to shows like that, I kind of look for these little things, the human interest stories, that are a little bit more moderately priced and accessible, but nonetheless tell us something about the World War II era.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to see that these items made it into good hands.
They make for incredible conversation pieces in the classroom.
Definitely. All right, I see we now have a bag sitting up here. I'm curious to hear the story behind this and its significance, so tell us a bit about that.
This would have been a bag for personal items, extra socks, clothes, toiletries, and things of that manner that were very common among officers especially, who were infantrymen and the like. This one belonged to Malcolm W. Gary, and he was an officer in the 4th Infantry Division, and he had been a veteran of the Normandy campaign. He was from Raymond, Mississippi, and I found through my research, interestingly enough, he had been part of the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression, and he worked and encamped at Vicksburg National Military Park. And so during the Great Depression, he was helping to care for and maintain that famous Civil War battlefield. Another piece of interest to me. So he had been rather seriously wounded while fighting in hedgerow country in Normandy. And he had been involved in the advance on Cherbourg, a lot of the contentious fighting leading up to all of that. And he earned a ticket home, and he was going to be shipped by aircraft back over the North Atlantic after his wounding, and he would be mended back home. But sadly, his plane went missing at the end of July 1944. And so what ended up happening is that his luggage made it home on a separate plane, but he did not. And this is his bag.
Wow.
And it has some personal belongings in it as well. But this is what his hometown newspaper, the Clarion Ledger, ultimately declared. And it wasn't until the following December, on the eve of the Battle of the Bulge, that he was finally declared dead. So he had been missing for almost half a year by that point. And his hometown newspaper said this: First Lieutenant Malcolm W. Gary, husband of Mrs. Evelyn Barnett Gary of Raymond, Mississippi, previously reported missing, has now been officially reported as killed July 26th. Lieutenant Gary was seriously wounded during the invasion of Normandy and was being evacuated back to the States from a hospital in England via air. And sadly enough, there were 17 other patients on the plane. There was a nurse taking care of them, and there were 5 civilians aboard as well. The plane was actually a civilian airliner that had been contracted out to remove military wounded back to the States. And every single one of those people remain missing to this day.
Wow.
But his luggage, eerily enough, made it home. And inside are 2 things that belong to him. A kit of religious materials for a Protestant serviceman. And this is from the USO, and there are a number of books and booklets inside that were distributed as spiritual and reading material. It was his because on the back in cursive in pencil, it is his name. So a very profound artifact to go along with it. And additionally, too, is his map of Cherbourg.
Wow.
And so he had a map of the city as the division was advancing.
Wow, that's some amazing stuff. Incredible to have that bag with some of his belongings in there and
yes,
have that story behind it.
And I have a number of very small and humble 4th Infantry Division artifacts like this. Those are my boys. My grandfather served in the 4th Infantry Division. I reenact along with my brother and friends. The 4th Infantry Division. We're part of the Furious 4th World War II Living History Group. If you're a reenactor in Pennsylvania, you can look us up sometime. But I have a special affinity for the boys of the Ivy Division.
Yeah, what an incredible piece to have in your collection.
What we have next here are some items that were donated to the Furious 4th, the living history organization that I'm involved with. And that's one of the great perks of doing living history. I'm sure you can relate to that a little bit, because sometimes you just are the recipients of these really magnanimous gestures where people give you something because they trust you and they feel that it will be in good hands and you'll use it for good educational purposes. Anything like that ever happened to you?
I have had some stuff come my way. After a while, you're kind of known as the history guy in some local circles, and then when someone uncovers that item in their attic or finally thinks it's time to get rid of that thing that's been in their closet, they see you as a good option.
Yeah, and that was exactly what happened with this portrait and the accompanying uniform. The young man who we see in this photograph was John W. Cox Jr., and he was a lieutenant in Company D, 8th Regiment, 4th Infantry Division. We received these items from his son, and his son sent a letter along with it, which I think is worthwhile to read here. The owner of this uniform was John W. Cox Jr., born in 1922. He was a resident of the Holmesburg section of Philadelphia. As a youth, his parents sent him and his brother to Pennsylvania Military College. His brother William was several years younger and did not participate in the war. With his graduation from PMC, he went directly into Officer Candidate School upon entry into the service after an abbreviated college career. I always wondered how difficult it must have been for a 22-year-old to be put into this position of leadership. Growing up, the war was never discussed. The only exception was what he saw of participation in regard to the Normandy invasion. I don't think he was in the initial wave and perhaps landed a day or two after the initial invasion. I assume in this era he would have been diagnosed with PTSD and had additional support. As an adult, I can see how he was functional but troubled. And so I was very much curious as to the background of Lieutenant Cox, and through the assistance of a friend that has rosters and daily reports and things like that, we found out that he was assigned to the 4th Infantry Division exactly 10 days after D-Day. And so the son was correct. He arrived there a little bit after the initial invasion. And we also found that he was rotated out of the unit due to combat exhaustion on August 7th, 1944. And so he was in the thick of it for 2 months, and then presumably he reached his mental breaking point, which was more common than a lot of people would think, because in the deadly environs of the Bocage country and just the high rate of attrition among officers especially, one can certainly not fault this gentleman for finding himself in a precarious situation as such. And I think that this too is something very important for us to take into account, because as we've come to accept more broadly in recent years, not all wounds are visible. Sometimes those scars lay deep inside combatants, and one can presume that perhaps Lieutenant Cox fought that battle for long afterward.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a common theme when talking to those veterans. You know, like you mentioned in that letter that his son wrote, you know, nowadays we would hope there's more support for things like that. But back then, a lot of the men felt like the war was over and it was time to put it behind them. And
it was also stigmatized to a greater extent as well. And a lot of men found comfort in the bottle rather than expressing their opinions or confiding in others. And so I would say to anybody watching, if you yourself are having struggles similar to this, talk to somebody about it. People are willing to listen, and I think this is one of the universal themes of combat and warfare. And hopefully we can be more helpful as time progresses.
Absolutely, I would hope so. Well, this is an amazing grouping. And it's great, like you said, that they gifted this to you to give it a good home. And I think you're definitely giving it that good home by sharing it with so many people and keeping this story alive. I think they picked a good person to
it's a responsibility that I don't take lightly. And I couldn't think of any better venue to share some of these stories than with you and your viewers.
Well, we appreciate that. Well, Jared, thank you so much for sharing those items with us.
My pleasure.
As I said, you have an incredible collection, not just these items, but many items in your personal collection that you've clearly done a lot of research on and care greatly for, and share them with your viewers on your page, Real History, and now with my viewers here on World War Wisdom.
It's my pleasure. Like I said, it's an important responsibility, and I would encourage anybody out there with World War II artifacts or aspiring collectors, seek to bring these stories to life. Do the research, give the people of the past voice, and if you have these things and you're not sure what to do with them, try to find a good home for them. Don't merely put them on eBay. Try to keep them in your family if possible, or find a local museum or historical society. That's where I often refer people to. So be stewards of the past, and the past will serve us well.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed going through those items with you today. As we mentioned before, we'll be doing another video on your page, so remember to subscribe to Real History so you can see me talk more with Jared over there. And other than that, thanks guys, and I'll see you in the next one.